January 1953. Dwight Eisenhower had just been inaugurated as president. Republicans had won both the presidency and Congress for the first time since 1928. The most powerful Republican in Washington wasn't the new president. It was Senator Joseph McCarthy from Wisconsin. McCarthy had spent 3 years investigating communist infiltration. His accusations had destroyed careers. He dominated headlines. Republican base voters believed he was the only politician willing to fight communism. Eisenhower despised him. In private conversations with staff, the president called McCarthy a demagogue. He said McCarthy's reckless methods damaged American institutions. But in public, Eisenhower refused to criticize McCarthy. When reporters asked about the senator's investigations, Eisenhower gave non-committal answers. This silence was deliberate. Eisenhower had decided that engaging with McCarthy would elevate him. Better to let the senator destroy himself. McCarthy's staff noticed the president's coldness. When they appeared at the same Republican events, Eisenhower kept his distance. The photographs from that period show the tension. What nobody understood was why Eisenhower seemed so confident that McCarthy would self-destruct. The senator was wildly popular. His investigations had momentum. His accusations resonated with voters terrified of Soviet expansion. Eisenhower's advisors warned him that staying silent made the president look weak, that McCarthy was becoming more powerful, that someone needed to confront him. Eisenhower disagreed. He told his staff to be patient. McCarthy would overreach. And when that happened, Eisenhower wouldn't intervene. The president's confidence seemed strange, almost as if he knew something others didn't, as if he possessed information that would change how everyone understood McCarthy's crusade. But Eisenhower said nothing. He maintained a silence that was louder than any shout. It wasn't passivity. It was a trap. And he waited, watching the senator walk right into it. February 9th, 1950, 3 years before Eisenhower took office. McCarthy gave a speech in Wheeling, West Virginia, that changed American politics. He claimed he had a list of State Department employees who were members of the Communist Party. The number he cited would be disputed. Some reporters heard 205, others heard 57. But the specific number mattered less than the accusation. The State Department was infiltrated by Soviet agents and communist sympathizers. The reaction was volcanic. The Truman administration demanded McCarthy provide his list. McCarthy refused. He said revealing names publicly would compromise ongoing investigations. Critics accused him of manufacturing a political controversy. The Washington Post called it a reckless smear campaign. But the public response was overwhelming. Americans believed him. Just weeks earlier, in January 1950, former State Department official Alger Hiss had been convicted of perjury for lying about passing documents to Soviet intelligence. A high-level government official, proven to be a spy, and they had watched China fall to communism despite billions in American aid. They had seen the Soviets detonate an atomic bomb years ahead of predictions. The idea that Soviet agents had infiltrated the government seemed like the only explanation. McCarthy sensed opportunity. He gave more speeches. Senate investigations began. Careers were destroyed. Government employees were fired based on circumstantial evidence. Association with suspected communists. Membership in organizations later identified as communist fronts. McCarthy couldn't prove espionage. He had fragments, rumors, guilt by association. But he presented it with such confidence that many Americans assumed the evidence must be stronger than what appeared publicly. By the time Eisenhower took office in January 1953, McCarthy had been conducting investigations for 3 years. He had survived challenges. He had grown more powerful. And Eisenhower, watching all of this, had made a decision. He would not confront McCarthy directly. He would wait for the senator to overreach. But what gave Eisenhower such confidence that McCarthy would fail? That question would only be answered years later. Eisenhower had spent his life in the military. He understood discipline, chain of command, the importance of maintaining institutional credibility. McCarthy violated everything Eisenhower believed about how leaders should behave. The senator was reckless, undisciplined, more interested in headlines than results. During the 1952 campaign, Republican leaders urged Eisenhower to embrace McCarthy. The senator was popular with the base. His anti-communist message resonated. Eisenhower refused to campaign with McCarthy. When they appeared at the same events, Eisenhower kept his distance. The president's closest advisors recorded his private comments. Eisenhower called McCarthy a disgrace to the Republican Party. He said McCarthy's methods were un-American. He predicted McCarthy would eventually destroy himself. But publicly, Eisenhower maintained careful silence. His press secretary, James Hagerty, recorded the strategy in his diary. The president told his staff he would not get into the gutter with McCarthy. To Eisenhower, the general who had commanded the mightiest armies in history, McCarthy wasn't just a political rival. He was a stain on the uniform, a chaotic force that lacked the one thing Eisenhower valued most: discipline. Yet discipline also meant patience. Eisenhower knew he couldn't just attack. There was a political reality to consider. McCarthy was popular with Republican voters. Attacking him could split the party. Eisenhower needed McCarthy's supporters for his legislative agenda. So Eisenhower maintained his strategic silence. He told his staff to be patient. McCarthy would eventually overreach. And when he did, Eisenhower would let the consequences unfold naturally. The president just had to wait for the right mistake. Early 1954. McCarthy made the miscalculation Eisenhower had been waiting for. The senator decided to investigate the United States Army for communist infiltration. This was different. The State Department was one thing, but the Army was Eisenhower's institution. He had commanded it. He wouldn't tolerate McCarthy attacking it. The trigger was personal. David Schein was a wealthy young associate of Roy Cohn, McCarthy's chief counsel. Schein had been drafted into the Army. McCarthy and Cohn wanted special treatment for him. Assignment to New York rather than deployment. Weekend passes, excused from duties, the Army refused. Schein was a private. He would be treated like any other draftee. No special privileges. McCarthy was furious. He launched an investigation claiming the Army was blocking his inquiries because they were hiding communist infiltration. The Army compiled evidence. They documented every demand McCarthy and Cohn had made for special treatment. The chronology showed McCarthy trying to use his Senate position to benefit a friend. Eisenhower gave quiet approval for the Army to fight back. No public statements from the president, no direct involvement. But behind the scenes, his staff coordinated with Army officials. Public hearings were scheduled for April 1954. They would be televised nationally. The first major Senate hearings broadcast live to American living rooms. Eisenhower's advisors were nervous. Televised hearings were unpredictable. McCarthy was skilled at creating dramatic moments. What if he dominated the proceedings? But Eisenhower remained calm, almost satisfied. He told his staff to let the hearings proceed. He knew something his advisors didn't. The truth was about to emerge. Eisenhower had been waiting for this moment, and now it was arriving. April 22, 1954. The Army-McCarthy hearings began. Millions of Americans watched on television. For 36 days, the hearings continued, and television revealed something newspapers never could. It showed McCarthy's actual behavior unfiltered. He interrupted constantly. He made dramatic accusations. He waved documents claiming they proved conspiracies. He badgered witnesses. He seemed unable to control himself. On radio or in newspaper reports, this had seemed aggressive but effective. On television, it looked like bullying. Under the glare of the hot studio lights, Americans saw the sweat on his brow and the manic glint in his eye. They didn't just see a politician making a point. They saw a man unraveling in real time. The Army's chief counsel was Joseph Welch, a Boston lawyer with a gentle manner, grandfatherly demeanor, quiet voice. He contrasted sharply with McCarthy's aggression. Welch systematically dismantled McCarthy's accusations. He showed that the senator's evidence was thin. His claims were exaggerated. His methods were abusive. As the hearings continued, McCarthy grew more desperate. His accusations became wilder. He attacked more aggressively. Television audiences watched this deterioration in real time. McCarthy's poll numbers began dropping. Politicians who had quietly supported him started distancing themselves. Eisenhower watched from the White House. His staff kept detailed notes on the hearings. The president made no public comments, but privately, his satisfaction was evident. McCarthy was destroying himself exactly as Eisenhower had predicted, and the president hadn't had to lift a finger. The hearings were grinding toward a climax. Everyone could sense it. McCarthy was cornered. He was lashing out. He was making mistakes. And then came June 9th, the moment that would finish him. June 9th, 1954. The hearing had been grinding on for hours. McCarthy needed to hit back at Welch. He was losing. McCarthy attacked one of Welch's young associates who wasn't even present at the hearings. Fred Fisher had been a member of the National Lawyers Guild years earlier. McCarthy claimed it was a communist front organization. This was gratuitous cruelty. Welch hadn't brought Fisher to Washington because of his past associations. McCarthy was just trying to hurt someone to score points. Welch responded with quiet devastation. He spoke directly to McCarthy. His voice was pained but controlled. He pointed out that McCarthy had promised not to bring up Fisher's name. The senator had broken that promise, just to damage a young lawyer's career. Then Welch asked the question, "Have you no sense of decency, sir? At long last, have you left no sense of decency?" The hearing room didn't just go silent. The air left the room. It was a heavy, suffocating silence. For the first time in 4 years, Joseph McCarthy had no answer. The bully had been punched back, and the entire country felt the impact. When McCarthy tried to stammer a response, Welch cut him off. He said he would not discuss it further. He had seen enough. The moment was televised nationally. Millions of Americans watched McCarthy exposed as a bully who would destroy anyone for political advantage. The impact was immediate. McCarthy's remaining public support collapsed. The senator who had been the most feared man in Washington was suddenly vulnerable. Eisenhower watched this moment. He made no public comment. He offered no defense of McCarthy. He simply let the destruction continue. The hearings concluded in late June. No clear winner was declared officially, but everyone knew what had happened. McCarthy was finished. And still, Eisenhower said nothing, as if he had been waiting for this outcome, as if he knew McCarthy's fall was inevitable. But why had Eisenhower been so confident? What did the president know that others didn't? When Eisenhower took office in January 1953, he had been briefed on one of the most closely guarded secrets in American intelligence. a code-breaking project that had been running since 1943. The Venona Project. American cryptanalysts had been decrypting Soviet intelligence cables, messages sent between Moscow and Soviet facilities in the United States. The cables were encrypted with one-time pads, theoretically unbreakable. But Soviet code clerks had made mistakes. They reused pages. This created vulnerabilities that American codebreakers exploited. Starting in 1946, cryptanalyst Meredith Gardner began successfully decrypting messages. Over several years, thousands of Soviet cables were broken. The messages revealed extensive Soviet espionage networks operating in the United States during the 1940s. The scale was staggering. The cables used code names for American sources, but careful analysis allowed identification of real people, cross-referencing biographical details, matching information in the cables with other intelligence. Approximately 349 Americans were identified as having provided information to Soviet intelligence. Some were committed communists, others were sympathizers. Some had been compromised through blackmail. The cables showed Soviet penetration of the Manhattan Project, the State Department, the Treasury Department, military intelligence. The espionage had been systematic and sophisticated. This was the information Eisenhower possessed when McCarthy was conducting his investigations. The president knew that McCarthy's core claim was correct. Soviet agents really had infiltrated the American government. But there was a critical constraint. The Venona Project could never be publicly acknowledged. Revealing it would tell the Soviets their codes had been broken. They would change their encryption systems. Future intelligence would be lost. Knowledge of Venona was restricted to a tiny circle. The president, FBI Director Hoover for specific investigations, a handful of intelligence officials. Congress wasn't told. State Department officials weren't briefed. And Joseph McCarthy, despite his Senate investigations into communist infiltration, was never cleared for Venona. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover quietly fed McCarthy tips derived from these secrets. But McCarthy was never given the proof. He was given conclusions. He was denied the evidence. This created an impossible situation. McCarthy was making accusations without access to systematic proof. The hard evidence sat in classified vaults, and Eisenhower had to decide what to do about it. Eisenhower's intelligence advisors made their position clear. Venona must remain classified. The code-breaking program was too valuable to compromise. If the Soviets learned their codes had been broken, they would completely overhaul their encryption systems. Years of intelligence work would be lost. Future espionage would be harder to detect. Eisenhower understood this. He knew the value of intelligence sources. They had to be protected. But there was another factor. Revealing Venona would vindicate McCarthy. It would prove the senator's core accusation was correct. Soviet infiltration had been extensive. McCarthy would become even more powerful. He would use the classified evidence to justify every excess. His investigations would expand. Any criticism of his methods would be dismissed as soft on communism. Eisenhower believed McCarthy was dangerous to American democracy. The senator's reckless accusations damaged institutions. His bullying tactics destroyed careers unjustly. If Eisenhower gave McCarthy access to Venona material, the senator wouldn't just be right. He would be unstoppable. The president would lose the ability to constrain him. Eisenhower made his decision. He would keep Venona classified. He would let McCarthy continue operating without the evidence. He would quietly block McCarthy's access to government personnel. Executive orders would restrict what information could be shared with congressional investigations. The Army would be instructed to resist McCarthy's demands. He would watch McCarthy overreach. He would allow the senator to destroy himself through his own excesses, and he would never reveal that proof existed. This was a cold calculation. McCarthy would be sacrificed to protect both the intelligence source and American institutions from the senator's methods. Eisenhower was a general who had sent men to die for strategic objectives. Ending McCarthy's political career without giving him access to classified vindication was an acceptable cost. When the Army-McCarthy hearings destroyed the senator on national television, Eisenhower didn't intervene. He let it happen. When the Senate moved toward censure, Eisenhower maintained his silence. He offered no defense. He had made his choice. Protect the source. Let McCarthy burn. Even if it meant innocent people would be destroyed in McCarthy's final wild accusations. Even if it meant the public would never understand the real scope of Soviet espionage. The intelligence capability mattered more. The Senate moved quickly after the Army hearings. A select committee was appointed to investigate McCarthy's conduct. The committee was chaired by Arthur Watkins, a conservative Republican who despised McCarthy's methods. He ran the proceedings with strict formality. The charges focused on McCarthy's behavior, abuse of power, contempt for Senate rules, bringing discredit to the institution. On December 2nd, 1954, the Senate voted 67 to 22 to censure McCarthy. Half the Republican caucus voted against their colleague. It was a stunning repudiation. The most powerful senator in America censured by his own colleagues. McCarthy gave a bitter speech. He claimed he was being punished for fighting communism. He predicted history would vindicate him. But the censure broke McCarthy's power completely. Committee chairmen stopped returning his calls. Reporters stopped covering his accusations. Other senators avoided him. McCarthy turned to alcohol, not for pleasure, as an anesthetic. He showed up intoxicated to Senate sessions, shouting at empty chairs. He gave rambling speeches to a chamber that had already moved on, wandering the halls like a ghost of his former self. The phone that used to ring every minute now sat silent. He couldn't accept what had happened. He had been fighting communist infiltration, a real threat. How could he have been destroyed for trying to protect America? Through all of this, Eisenhower said nothing. The president offered no support, no defense, no acknowledgement that McCarthy had been partially right about the problem, even if wrong about the methods. Eisenhower maintained the silence he had established from the beginning, as if McCarthy had never existed, as if the entire crusade had been beneath presidential notice. McCarthy died on May 2nd, 1957. He was 48 years old. Acute hepatitis from alcohol abuse. He was given a state funeral. 70 senators attended the service at Washington St. Matthew's Cathedral, along with more than 100 priests and over 2,000 mourners. Thousands more paid their respects in Appleton, Wisconsin. Eisenhower sent condolences but didn't attend. McCarthy died believing he had been right. He insisted to the end that Soviet agents had penetrated American government. He claimed history would vindicate his warnings. He never knew how close he had come to being proven correct. July 1995. The National Security Agency announced they were declassifying the Venona files. After more than 50 years of secrecy, the Soviet cable decrypts would be released to the public. The Cold War had ended. The Soviet Union had collapsed in 1991. The intelligence rationale for secrecy no longer existed. Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan had pushed for declassification. He argued the public deserved to know the truth. Approximately 3,000 Venona messages became public. Historians immediately recognized the significance. These were actual Soviet intelligence cables, primary source documents revealing espionage operations in unprecedented detail. The cables confirmed that Soviet espionage during the 1940s had been extensive and sophisticated. Hundreds of Americans had provided information to Soviet handlers. The revelations forced complete reassessment of the McCarthy era. The evidence showed McCarthy's core warning about infiltration had been correct, though he was often chasing the wrong timeline. Most Venona spies had operated during World War II and had already left the government by the time McCarthy began his crusade in 1950. The State Department had been penetrated, but in the 1940s. By 1950, many of those agents were gone. McCarthy claimed the house was currently on fire. Venona proved the fire had happened years ago, and the arsonist had already fled. But the cables also showed that many of McCarthy's specific accusations had been wrong. He had destroyed people who weren't in the Venona files. He had made baseless claims about individuals with no connection to Soviet intelligence. The most devastating revelation was that government officials had possessed this evidence during McCarthy's investigations. President Eisenhower had known the truth. He had been fully briefed on the Venona decrypts. While historians debate how much President Truman was told about the specific code breaking, Eisenhower's knowledge is confirmed. He had chosen to keep it secret. This raised profound questions. Should presidents withhold evidence to protect intelligence sources? What happens when that secrecy destroys innocent people alongside guilty ones? Conservative scholars felt vindicated. They had argued Soviet espionage was real. Now they had documentary proof. Liberal scholars had to reconsider decades of writing about the Red Scare as mass hysteria. The threat had been genuine, even if McCarthy's response was excessive. But the Venona revelations didn't rehabilitate McCarthy. His methods remained indefensible. The innocent lives he destroyed couldn't be justified by the fact that some real spies existed. The tragedy was that McCarthy never knew. He died 38 years before the files were declassified. He went to his grave believing he was right, but unable to prove it. Eisenhower had made sure of that. The president had chosen to protect the intelligence source rather than vindicate McCarthy or guide proper investigations. The human cost was real. Lives destroyed while systematic proof sat in classified vaults, because one president decided what mattered more. The declassification of Venona revealed not just Soviet espionage, but Eisenhower's calculation. The president had faced a genuine dilemma with no good options: reveal Venona and compromise valuable intelligence capabilities, or stay silent and watch McCarthy destroy innocent people alongside legitimate security concerns. Eisenhower chose to protect the source. From a narrow counterintelligence perspective, he was right. Venona continued producing intelligence for years. The code-breaking capability remained valuable. But there was more to Eisenhower's decision than protecting intelligence. The president wanted McCarthy destroyed. The senator's methods offended every institutional value Eisenhower held. McCarthy's bullying tactics damaged American credibility internationally. His reckless accusations undermined civil liberties. His grandstanding made serious counterintelligence work harder. Handing over the Venona files would have weaponized McCarthy beyond control. Eisenhower calculated that America would be better off with McCarthy destroyed than with McCarthy vindicated and empowered, even if it meant hiding evidence, even if it meant innocent people would suffer. This was leadership through deliberate inaction. Eisenhower didn't attack McCarthy publicly. He didn't defend him. He simply refused to save him. When McCarthy attacked the Army, Eisenhower let the institution fight back. When the televised hearings destroyed McCarthy's credibility, Eisenhower stayed silent. When the Senate censured McCarthy, Eisenhower offered no intervention. The strategy worked. McCarthy was eliminated as a political force. American institutions survived. The intelligence source remained protected. The cost was paid by people caught in McCarthy's accusations during his final desperate period. Careers ruined, reputation destroyed, lives damaged. Eisenhower accepted that cost. From his perspective, it was worth it to eliminate McCarthy while preserving intelligence capabilities and institutional credibility. The question that haunted the decision was whether Eisenhower could have found middle ground. Could he have declassified limited Venona material to guide investigations without revealing the full code-breaking program? He didn't even try. He decided that any access to Venona would empower McCarthy unacceptably. Better to let the senator burn completely. History eventually proved Eisenhower right about protecting Venona. The intelligence remained valuable. The capability was preserved. But history also revealed the human cost. The innocent people destroyed. The distorted public understanding that lasted for decades. Eisenhower made a commander's choice. Sacrifice the individual to protect the capability. Accept collateral damage to achieve the strategic objective. McCarthy was the sacrifice. The innocent people caught in his investigations were collateral damage. And the truth stayed buried for 38 years. Because Eisenhower, the cold commander to the very end, decided that some truths are too dangerous to be known. And that in the war for survival, even a man like McCarthy was just another acceptable loss.